Well, hello there, and welcome to Under the Cowling. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum, and this is the jump off of a new segment we're going to do twice a month where, we do Warbird Wednesday, but Warbird Wednesday, we work through things pretty quickly. We only have about 20, 21 minutes. We have to cover a lot of territory. This is going to get a little bit more in depth, and so bear with us. If you have questions, send your questions in on the chat. I have my serendipitous assistant today. Greg Kenny is off camera. We are going to get Greg to do a cameo at some point, but he will let me know if we have questions. The hangar is probably about 126 degrees with the doors open right now, so if one of us passes out, we'll just keep working through it. We do have a medical doctor here, so Mike can step in if he has to. But with me today, I have Mike Flieger. He is our P-51 pilot, and he flies Bunny, and eventually he will fly Man of War when she comes out of her bridging inspection and her annual. And I have Todd Ward, and Todd is a little bit, he's involved in the ownership of Man of War. And you actually, Todd, if you didn't know this, you are coming kind of like the Great Buffalo. And what I mean by that look, I can see the surprise there. Okay. There are not a lot of direct owners who are involved with these Warbirds anymore. We're headed more and more to where these big owners with collections and these, like the, Paul Allen and these guys that own these aircraft, and they own a whole stable of them. The individual owners, because of the sheer cost of the airplanes, is headed to the, I think, out to pasture. We're one of the few independent museums left that still flies. There are a few, of course, Planes of Fame, which is west of us, which has a fantastic collection, and of course Steve Hinton, which is an amazing pilot. So Todd, and I know since this is our, by the way, there's no wrong way to do this. Okay, we're going to do 45 minutes. It's just off the cuff. Greg is a stickler for hospitality, so you're sweating today. So Greg made sure that you had a fresh wet nap to wipe down with. If you have a blood sugar issue, he made sure you had some cookies. And then, of course, it's 5 o'clock somewhere in the world. And today we have a nice orange wheat Hangar 24. We usually do a drink in the stage 2. Greg insisted that we have a drink. It is Saturday. So if you wish to partake, there is a orange wheat Hangar 24 beverage sitting next to you. And, of course, Hangar 24 is not a sponsor of this program, as we always do in every one of our Warbird Wednesday when Greg feeds me some bizarre drink. So with that, Todd, I thought maybe what we could start with is Man of War has an amazing history. There are a lot of P-51s out there. There are very few P-51s that have like any history in England, as an example. This airplane actually made it out to the hinterland, and we can talk about that, and came back. Most of them didn't. Why don't you give us just a brief overview of maybe the airplane and how your family got involved, and we'll start there, and then we'll work through. When I say brief, 45 minutes won't work, so jump in.
Well, I honestly don't remember all the details before, in the military. I think it was February 15th that the airplane was made, 1945.
Cheers.
And we do know, like you said, it went over to England, and it was there for about 6 months, as I remember, and then it came back, and it was in a guard unit. I don't remember where.
That's good enough, by the way.
Okay.
But with the family, how did you guys get involved with it?
Yeah, then the airplane went to Universal Studios, where they used it in 2 movies I know of. One was Battle Hymn, and the other one I don't remember, although there's a good article about it in this issue.
Of Mustangs. Is that the most current issue of Mustangs?
No, this was winter 2018.
So if you can find that online, winter 2018 Mustang has a good history on the airplane.
It does. But Universal Studios used it for a couple movies that I know of. And in 1969, Asher Ward, who's no relation, but a good guy. Asher's a good guy. He became aware of the airplane. He was made aware of the airplane. And he contacted Universal Studios to see if he could get the airplane or buy it from them. And ultimately, he was able to trade an airplane for them, another airplane that actually was a mock-up that they wanted. So he traded the airplane, and then he got the airplane to Van Nuys, and I guess he went to register the airplane, and at some point he got a letter from the Air Force saying, "Thank you for finding our airplane, please return it."
Wow.
Because the studio apparently never had ownership of the airplane. It was just on a definite loan, and of course it got lost in Air Force records, and as soon as she tried to register the airplane, it showed up. And so for him to be able to keep the airplane, for him to be able to keep the Air Force from taking it, he had to make himself a museum. So he made himself a museum. He kept the airplane, and then eventually he was able to trade another airplane, a helicopter, to the Air Force and get ownership of the airplane. So in '71, he was finally able to get a bill of sale from the Air Force. And so then it finally became his. He got the airplane flying, I want to say, like 73 maybe, 72, 73, got the airplane flying. And flew it for 2-3 years, and then decided to sell the airplane. And my dad bought it in 1975. And then it was poontang then, but my dad didn't like the poontang. So after 1 year, we painted the airplane like it is now, and then in 2007, the ownership transferred to my brother and me, and then so here we are today.
Now you're a pilot as well, right?
Yeah, I've got 300-ish hours in the airplane.
In this airplane?
Yeah.
Very cool.
And a few other Mustangs, but yeah.
Very cool. I wonder why you're always eyeing Bunny trying to steal it. Now I know why. So, well, that's interesting. And Mike, you're a current P-51 pilot. In other words, you fly for us. Mm-hmm. How did you, and I don't know that you and I have ever talked about this, how did you're an underachiever. You're an aerospace engineer and a trauma doctor, if I'm using that correct. You're an emergency physician. To me, anytime I go to emergency, that's trauma. So, where'd you get the bug? How did you get the bug? And the ratings you have, I mean, you can fly, you're ready to fly this airplane, but you have a jet rating, a formation rating. I mean, you've got a lot of work in this. How did you get started doing that? What was the level of interest?
Well, I had family that were in World War II, so I always had an interest in World War II, and especially flying. And I've wanted to fly ever since I could remember. So when I was 14, I wanted to learn to fly in gliders, but that got nixed for a couple of years. And starting at age 16, I did get my glider rating, and then coming out to California to work in the early 80s, I added on an airplane rating. And at the time I was living in Ohio, went back to Ohio and got a lot of tailwheel time at the glider club. I was a fanatic about flying gliders.
Tailwheel time is
flying planes that are conventional gear that sit on the tail, like the Stearman biplane and several others, especially a lot of our museum aircraft.
We're geeking out here.
Yes,
exactly. Got the nose hole where it should be.
Yeah. We're geeking out here, so I want to make sure we don't get too far into geek land. Somebody goes, what the heck are they talking about?
Yes.
So you got tailwheel time, and
and quite a bit. Flying in the glider club, we flew in all kinds of conditions, and it was a very good experience. Without knowing it, I was doing tons of takeoffs and landings, and so flying tailwheel aircraft became very natural for me, and flying off of grass, concrete, etc. And fast forward through changing careers from aerospace engineering to medicine, and
there's just, why not? I mean, you're an aerospace engineer, why not become a doctor?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it was actually some connections I made through the glider club that started me that direction.
Really?
So, yeah, exactly. And but then in Ohio, I had flown the L-19 and the Stearman, and those were two Warbirds that I had flown. And I always wanted to fly the fighters, but I didn't really have a good feel for exactly how to do it. And then when I got here, in Arizona, I found a fellow who did instruction in T-6s. So I would go up and fly with him every now and then. Got checked out in the T-6, and then I decided I had to quit altogether or buy my own. So I bought my own. And then after I put several hundred hours on my T-6, a friend offered to let me fly his Mustang, and that just parlayed into several other Warbirds, from the Mustang to the Corsair, to the Wildcat, to some of the jets, and then continuing various and another aircraft as well. The Stearman. I still had my T6. I ended up putting about 1,100 hours on it before I sold it, and then here we are today.
Well, that is very cool. Now, Todd, how did you? I mean, getting into these airplanes, which is like a Ferrari, right? Going from a family station wagon to a Ferrari. How did you get involved? I mean, obviously you had the airplane, so there's an impetus there. But maybe how did you're a pilot, how did you get the bug?
Well, my route was a little considerably different than Mike's. Mine was much simpler, actually. My dad instilled the bug from when I was young. And we go to Orange County Airport and watch airplanes take off and land. And there was a Mustang out there, and every once in a blue moon, we'd see it fly. So I thought that was really cool. My dad always liked the Mustang, and he always wanted to fly. So I think it was 1965, he bought his first airplane, which was a Luscombe. He always wanted a tail dragger, but he wanted to fly. So he got himself a Luscombe and got his license in that airplane, and then he got a Cessna 185, got rid of the Luscombe, got a Cessna 185, and by the time I was old enough, when I was approaching 16, he wanted me to fly. I was interested in flying, but he wanted me to learn a tail dragger. And out at Chino at that time, there was a flying school out there that had a J3, had a Cub.
Oh.
So he wanted me to learn the Cub, like he did way back. He learned how to fly back in the 40s, actually, but never did get his license. But so I learned to fly in the J3, and on my 17th birthday, I got my license, and then I flew the 185. He checked me out in the 185, and then in '74, he bought a T6. So we both flew the T6, and we both flew it from the back seat, so we can get ready. And when I first flew this, it was in '75. It was in, I think, September '75, and I had about 250 hours total time, and about 50 hours in the T6, including some backseat time. Some of it, before we flew this, Steve would fly both of us. We both flew Steve. Steve flew in the T6 in the front seat. We fly in the back seat. So, because he's the one that checked us out in the airport.
Hinton?
Steve Hinton, yeah.
Okay.
And so he gave us the blessing, so we're ready to go. So we both flew it. And I had, like I said, I only had about 50 hours in the T6. 250 hours total time climbing into the Ferrari and flying away.
Wow.
Well, you know, the interesting thing about these airplanes is that, you know, if you think about it, at the end of the war, they were plentiful. They were in fact, they couldn't get rid of them fast enough. With Bob Friend and Harry Stewart, I talked to Harry Stewart. I said, "What happened to your airplane?" Because we were looking for it. And he said, "Oh, I flew it to a depot and I watched them cut the tail off of it." This was in Italy, which is what happened to most of the combat aircraft that were overseas. I mean, this is highly unusual that it made it back, because they were pushing them off ships, they were burying them, they were doing whatever they could do because they were done. And fast forward now to where we're flying them and other operators, you know, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, but the airplanes are no longer plentiful. We've lost the industrial backbone. From my perspective as an operator on the business side of it, I don't know what you guys do as magic, right? But from a business standpoint, we don't have. That's the advantage of being on an airport. We don't have the industrial backbone that they used to have. You know, where you send engines off. Like right now, you go online and order a 350 online, and it shows up. There's an industrial backbone. This Merlin sitting behind me, it's almost all maintained on by cottage industry stuff now, which is a real challenge. And so, Mike, maybe you could kind of talk a little bit about the challenges of operating in this environment as you see them, and then Todd, we can talk about that a little bit as well. But what do you know, we're certainly not in a depot era where you can send the airplane to a depot and it comes back. Does that present you with certain challenges?
Well, we operate the airplanes a little bit differently. We tend to baby them a little bit more, I would say, and there are still some of those cottage industry folks, like you mentioned. In fact, the Wards, I believe, have had Pioneer Aero.
Yeah, Pioneer Aero Service, yeah.
Used to have, be able to make almost all Mustang parts, I believe, and keep them in inventory.
Yeah.
And
they are.
I'm setting Todd up for that. You're
Oh,
going
there you
right
go.
down
Okay.
where I'm going.
Yeah,
So,
okay, well, hopefully
but
I
keep
haven't spoiled
going.
you.
You're doing really good. So,
But there are 2 or 3 different engine manufacturers, and one of the things I've tried to do ever since I started flying Warbirds was to attend the National Warbird Operator Conferences that are held every year, because it gives a state of the art and where everyone's at. I've usually tried to attend the Mustang forums, and there are 2 or 3 different engine makers that attend those, and they have assured us that they can supply parts for quite a while to come. But if those 2 or 3 cottage industries don't succeed, that would be a really bad thing for the Warbird movement. So.
I think the biggest thing that concerns me, and we'll jump over to Todd, is, this engine behind me, or in this airplane, is probably about, and Todd, you chime in here, probably about $250,000 any way you cut it, if you have to go out and replace it. And we're competing against hoarders, or guys. Anytime a Merlin block or engine comes up now on for sale, you have guys that have 20 in a warehouse somewhere that are looking for that 21st, right? So you're competing against them. And then I think you hit a really good point, which is, and I've said that to, do we have an anti-aircraft gun? We may have to shoot him down if he keeps interrupting us here. But the challenge is, if whoever goes out and gets hit by a car, the industrial knowledge, the institutional knowledge is just gone. And that, on a business level, is spooky. I don't know that there's any way around it. I've looked at it. I don't think there is. But the fact that, to your point, that you've got 2 or 3 guys, and if the guy's driving down the road one day and has an accident, that institutional memory is gone, and that option, it gets pretty narrow at that point to keep them flying. And that's our effort right now is to keep them going, because people. It's one thing to see any of these airplanes sitting in a museum. It's another one to see them spitting and coughing and doing everything that they do to fly. It's a completely different experience.
It is, I agree.
Todd, what's your take on that? I mean, do you have any opinions?
Well, I think there are enough of the builders around. If something unfortunate happened and one of them disappeared, there's still enough around that would know all the details. And I of course have no idea where the stopping point would be, but if everything could be made during World War II to make those engines, it can be made today. It's just a matter of how much does somebody want to spend to make whatever.
It all comes down to money, doesn't it?
When you run out of parts, like these landing gear trunnions up here,
Right.
They're being made brand new for a lot of money.
Yeah, what are they? They're like, just to give somebody an idea, they're like $17,000 a piece.
I was told only like $20,000 a piece for
Yeah,
those.
that's what I heard.
They're brand new.
The trunnion. Well, let me explain what a trunnion is. Again, we're down in total geek land, but let's tell them what a trunnion is.
Well, it's in this airplane. It's that very very top of the landing gear there. It's that you can just see a little bit of it sticking out there, and it's got a shaft on it that is what the landing gear pivots on. It goes the top of the landing gear goes into it, and then has a shaft that goes into the wing, and it pivots on that. That's the trunnion in there. But just that one piece is like
That's
$20,000.
expensive. Yeah, and we were talking about an engine, $250,000, carb, 35, 40.
And there are a handful of parts that are being made new for those engines, but
right.
when you get into the major parts, the big pieces, it's going to be expensive, but it can be done.
Full disclosure, that's our steerman running around this patch right now, and I think we may shoot him down at some point. And if we lose a trunnion, the gear falls off the airplane, or pretty much.
Right. If the trunnion breaks,
that's a bad day.
The landing gear breaks.
That it's a bad day. So the other thing about the airplanes, and this is more of a flight envelope issue conversation, is I am not, and the pilots in our program know this. I'm not a big advocate about low-level aerobatics, even low-G aerobatics in the airplanes. Mike, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. my view of it is these were high altitude interceptors. They're heavy airplanes. I don't mind seeing them fly around the patch straight and level, or a banana pass, wing low, and get some good photographs, but I'm not a big fan of low-level aerobatics. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and the envelope of the airplane down low. The best thing that ever happened to me was when we restored Bunny, which is now 5-6 years ago. I got to be with Bob Friend, and Bob Friend was, a seasoned P-51 pilot, and also did Air Force. He was an Air Force flight test. And the guy was a genius. He was also an airplane whisperer. I could have him hang around our guys, and he would, the airplane would do something. He says, "Well, have you tried this?" And 99% of the time, he was right. He'd been around him so long. Bob, we've lost Bob a little over a year ago, which is a tremendous loss. But first of all, I've been hanging around this about 10 years. I still don't know anything. That's the first thing. I really don't. You just scratch the surface. But maybe, hanging around Bob was helpful, really helpful to me, to just, sometimes when you get those knowledgeable people, shut up and listen. And there's nothing more than you're a sponge. So why don't you talk about low-level flight in the airplane and how we fly them for air shows as opposed to what they were really designed for, which is a completely different animal.
As far as flying low level, there are some folks that do some really great air show routines low level in a variety of aircraft. Two folks that I know of that do them in Mustangs, several in other aircraft as well. We don't do that with the museum aircraft, obviously, and I know of several highly experienced pilots who have died doing low level aerobatics. So the risk to the pilot and the airplane is higher than normal flight. I do think it's important to be proficient in aerobatics, but to do it up high, where there's a little bit of room in case a maneuver doesn't come out exactly the way you thought it would. Down low, there's just very little margin to make that correction. There have also been some very good articles recently about low-level aerobatics, and if you want to receive training in it, how you do that, and otherwise the advice to not do it if you don't have a real need to. It's a needless risk.
Why don't we talk about laminar wing a little bit and really dig into that piece, because that's part of it, right?
Yeah, with the Mustang, one of the aerodynamic design changes on the Mustang was the laminar flow wing. So they were trying to really dig into performance during that part of the war, where they were trying to get better aircraft than the opposite side. And one of those changes was they found that the P-51A was faster than the P-40, which was what it was replacing. And then they tried to tweak aerodynamics to get as much out of it as they could. And so the laminar flow wing was one of those things. And it delays the separation of laminar flow back later on the wing, as opposed to some of the Navy aircraft that have a big thick wing up front and they have a very nice stall characteristic. The Mustang wing probably doesn't give you as much warning as those nice thick Navy wings do.
And that was primarily, correct me if I'm wrong, was carrier activity because of the flight envelope for characters. They had to have that, where this airplane didn't require that. If I'm wrong, correct me.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, they did carrier trials with the Mustang, and it just didn't work out too well because the Mustang needed to come in too fast. So not too many people know that, but they did. I did not
know that.
They did, yeah.
Wow.
And they gave up pretty early on with that. But the Mustang wing, I would say, will give you some warning, but it's probably less than a lot of the other winged aircraft, like the Navy aircraft. And the other thing that the training programs will teach you about the Mustang is, once you do stall the wing, you actually have to clean it up. You have to go well above the minimum flying speed that you get, because it's still going to carry some dirty air back on the wing that's waiting for it to stall at a higher speed than it did the first time. So that also has been several people. So they've stalled down low. They've thought they've gotten out of the stall regime of the wing and the airplane, and then they think they can start pulling out, and all of a sudden the wing stalls again at a much higher speed than it did originally. And so that's one of the things about the Mustang in particular that's important to know and to be trained on.
And Todd, I mean, from an owner standpoint, I mean, I know I have my opinion, and a museum and a flying museum opinion is a little bit different than a private owner. But my view of it is let people see the airplane fly in a nice, clean envelope, very safe. Bring it back, and let them talk to Mike or fly in the airplane. I don't think there's any reason, this is my opinion, to do anything just even remotely crazy in these airplanes, because they're not plentiful anymore, and we can talk a little bit about the insurance environment that we're operating in right now, which is difficult. But Todd, what's your take on that? Do you have any opinion?
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I won't disagree with you in this scenario. And the low-level aerobatics, really, there's really no need for them in these airplanes anymore. But I'm not against doing aerobatics, but like Mike said, up at altitude. I think it's good. I think it is good to do aerobatics, and I know that my dad, that's all he wanted the airplane for.
Really?
He just wanted it to go out and do aerobatics. That's all he wanted. He'd go
Really?
out every week, and he'd go out and just do some whoop-de-doos and woofer-dills, and that's what he lived for.
Wow.
That's all he ever did in the airplane, unless we're going someplace. But if somebody wanted to be in the back seat, hopefully they won't throw up.
That is not fun in a Mustang.
No, it's not fun in any airplane. But so that was his purpose for having the airplane. And if you look at what Crazy Horse does in their training, you talk about rocking the airplane up, and they put it through the ringer in the training.
Yeah, and I think there's a place for it, but the days that we call it scud running, especially because of insurance, I think for those watching, insurance, the business of operating these airplanes has gotten much more difficult over the last, let's say, 5 years. We don't have as many carriers. When we do have a problem, the first issue is that people see shiny airplanes. And so we're always at fault, no matter what. And I think we are going to shoot him down, I think, right about now. But, part of there's that old God didn't build it, right? And you are going to get a point where you're up there and you're wishing you were down there, and that happens. It's just the way, it's a machine. It's like your car. But it is interesting, I think, as we go along, that I think the actual business challenges are going to be, the maintenance challenges are big, and they're expensive.
Yeah.
But I think the business issues are going to be the things that start grounding airplanes more than anything else. I devour stuff, and I was reading Battle of Britain flight, what the Brits do. And one of the things that was interesting to me was, those Spits, they operate almost completely in a military configuration with radios, guns, the whole 9 yards. I mean, they literally go in and charge the guns, and, we don't have that. Mike, maybe you could talk a little bit about this airplane, and you touched on it briefly, but it doesn't have the configuration that it had in World War II. Right. Most notably, I think, and I could be wrong, is that there's some center of gravity changes in the airplane with equipment and everything like that. Mm-hmm. And maybe you could kind of, again, we're down in Geekland, and I apologize if the 3 people that are watching us, 2 of them have lapsed into a coma. But maybe you talk about center of gravity issues and that kind of thing. Military versus how we are operating now.
Yeah. Well, one thing that set the Mustang apart was its range. And to achieve that, it had 2 large tanks in the wing, and it also had a fuselage tank. And the fuselage tank has a cap. You might be able to see it under some of the swastikas there in the just aft of the cockpit area. But the fuselage tank was there to hold 82 gallons, I want to say. Someone will have to correct me there, maybe 85.
I think it was 85.
85, yeah.
But placard was 65.
Yeah. And part of that was because of the CG issue. The airplane also had a lot of radios and armor plating behind the pilot's seat. And in modern times we don't have that. So now that configuration, the way it was set up, was very convenient, because taking all that stuff out leaves a beautiful spot to put a passenger seat.
Which is what we're doing.
Exactly what we do.
Right.
And so that is nice. But as you can imagine, 85 gallons of fuel at 6 pounds per gallon is a lot of weight there. And the pilots were instructed to try to burn the fuselage tank down really as quickly as they could to get it into a good CG range. We don't have that issue today. So there are maybe 1 or 2 Mustangs out there that still carry the fuselage tank, but I don't know anyone that uses it to put fuel in it.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Boise B was configured pretty close to a World War II Mustang as far as all the little bits.
Yeah, and there was one called Geraldine, which was very accurate as well. The other one called Hell or Bust also was very accurate. But to be honest, I don't know whether they have the fuselage fuel tank back there. Most of them have radios. If they're not real, then they're at least dummy radios, and they look real behind the pilot's seat, and they have the armor plating behind the pilot.
I think part of that too is weight. I mean, you know, the sheer weight of all that stuff, especially if we're using an airplane as a ride airplane. Why have all that? Well, first of all, you couldn't do it if you had that behind the pilot, but gun displays and stuff like that, the spits, there's no way you can do it. Well, there are some of them that are modified with that second bubble in the fuselage further back, but a spit doesn't lend itself to. I do not have my glasses on. Is that a Brit saying Spitfire? There you go. It's like catnip for British people. I bought up Spitfire, and there's a British guy now heckling me off camera. But the spits don't lend themselves to riders the way this does with the removal of the equipment.
Yes.
So I don't think they have the. First of all, the Spitfire is national pride airplane, obviously for the United Kingdom. But talk about weight and the differences in weight between. We talked about CG. The weight difference is significant as well, isn't it?
Yes, pretty significant. Now the basic airframe itself is pretty much identical to what it was in World War II. Same thing with the engine. The cockpit area is the main difference, and in the wings, obviously we're not carrying guns, but to carry 6 50 caliber guns is a lot of weight, and I can't remember how much ammo. I think it was 1,800 rounds of ammo. Yeah, and again, I think there's probably people off camera that know exactly how much ammo it carried.
Yeah.
But, I know the inner two guns had a longer belt than the outer two on each wing. But I want to say 1,800 rounds, but that's a lot of weight, 50 caliber plus all the metal to hold it all together. We don't carry that, obviously.
Right.
We also don't carry drop tanks. Now, on the flip side, back then, they had 130 octane fuel.
Right.
So they could push those engines a lot harder on takeoff and lift that huge weight off the ground to get to where they needed to go while they were burning off some of the weight of the fuel.
And I'm going to get down in the geek land again, but I know what it is. But for people watching, let's talk about octane rating and what the difference is. You bring that up. And I'm not talking in chemical terms, but just in layman's term. Why don't you talk about octane difference? And that is critically important.
Yes. These aircraft engines have very high compressions. In fact, they have superchargers to pressurize the air before it goes into the cylinders. And as opposed to car engines, we all know the souped up sports cars and dragsters that have souped up engines, superchargers on them perhaps. These engines did, and that was mainly so that they could continue their performance way up at altitude. But when you pressurize the fuel air mixture before it goes into a cylinder, it's almost at a point where it could explode. So this engine has an aftercooler, so it cools that fuel air mixture. And one of the other ways you delay the explosion and how rapidly it burns is by increasing the octane number. So if you have a higher octane fuel, you can put it in under higher pressure and not have it do what's called detonation in the cylinders, because when the engine is turning, the way it produces power is the fuel burns very rapidly, but it's still a burn, not an explosion, and it pushes the piston down. But if the fuel mixture in the cylinder explodes, it tends to blow holes in the piston over time. And in this airplane, that can happen very rapidly. And that's one of the things that is so important on training pilots, is how to manage the engine, the manifold pressure and RPM ratios, and the mixture control. So
is that when you talk about managing a manifold pressure, and we are so down in geek land.
Uh-oh, now we're getting down in geek
Oh
land
my
again,
goodness,
so-
we are totally geeking out. But this is for people who are real aficionados. This is why we're doing this stuff, because we can talk about that. Talk about the number of inches, and how you're managing manifold pressure and mix and stuff like that, because that's.
Yeah, the mixture controller on this airplane is actually fairly simple. Most general aviation airplanes have a continuous way to vary the mixture going into the engine, and they can set it so it's optimum at all times. This has basically 3 settings, so it's rich, auto lean, and idle cutoff. And so when we're at higher power settings, we have it in rich, and the carburetor automatically adjusts the fuel-air ratio even as we climb in altitude to be the proper ratio at the altitude you're at. And that's very important. Also, if you're at 400 miles an hour and all of a sudden you pull up and gain 10,000 feet, you don't want the pilot taking his eye off of someone he's trying to follow and having to tweak his mixture. So the engine does that automatically.
Okay.
We manage that very carefully, and it's important in training to learn how to do that. So.
And we're going to wake people up again. Todd, I'm going to come back to you. The markings on this aircraft with the tiger stripes, and you touched on something, the victory markings on the airplanes, the swastikas. If it were Japanese, they'd be either round, Japanese, or the Imperial Navy flag or whatever on the side of the airplane. People don't understand what that is. That's aerial victories. And it's interesting when I talked to Bob Friend about it. Bob had a very pragmatic view of it, because I did an interview with him at the Nixon Library, and I said something about kill markings, right? And there was a number of aerial kills, and Bob had a way of he was a very soft-spoken man, but he would touch your arm, and if he touched your arm, that was a demonstration that was serious. He wanted your full attention, and he said to me, it wasn't kill markings, it was aerial victories. I was never out to kill the other pilot. I was out to prove that I was a better pilot than the other pilot. And Bob was a wingman for the commander of the Tuskegees, and that's a whole other story. But he flew, I think, 142 combat missions, but a lot. And I asked him, why'd you fly so many? He says, well, there weren't any replacements. I flew until I either couldn't fly anymore or whatever. But I thought that was an interesting statement. It was very powerful if you think about it, which is he was more interested in skills and proving that he could outfly the other guy. This aircraft has a number of aerial victory markings on it. Now, my understanding, and you may know or you may not know, is that the tiger stripes actually were on the airplane, then he took them off because the Germans were gravitating to the markings on the airplane.
That's our understanding. Yeah, we really don't know how long they were on there, but I think we have some photographic proof that it was around 2 weeks, because the Germans apparently went after him because of those stripes on there. So he took them off. We don't know why he put them on there. Unfortunately, he wasn't around to ask. But our only guess is that maybe he thought, since he was mostly strafing, that was most of those victories are for strafing.
Or ground aircraft?
Ground
kills. Yeah,
ground kills. A handful of them are aerial, but most of them are strafing. So we're just guessing he put those on there thinking that would make him blend in with the terrain. But apparently it just attracted the Germans. It attracted them, and so he didn't want the attention.
That's interesting with the Germans, because the Germans, yellow nose aircraft were like section or squadron leaders, or they were somebody high up, right? Yellow nose 109s or FW190s or whatever. But the Germans adopted the yellow nose originally as an identification marker in France, and it only later gravitated towards somebody of importance, which totally made them stand out to our guys. They're looking at that and going, okay. But the Germans have a history all the way back to the World War I with the Jasta squadrons and flying circus about really colorful airplanes. I mean, they were flying circus; they were very colorful. Japanese, completely different animal as far as the way they painted their airplanes. They weren't as I guess maybe it was because of, and somebody maybe knows or has a reason, maybe in service of the emperor, because they all believed that they were in service of the emperor, that it was culturally, not good to be flamboyant. Japanese airplanes, which takes me to something else, Mr. Flieger.
Okay.
You fly the Wildcat.
Yes.
Why don't you talk about comparing? We have about 5 minutes, the Wildcat versus the P-51 as far as the difference. I mean, obviously a radial versus inline engine, but
Sure. Oh boy, wow, they're so different. It's hard to compare similarities.
well, or just contrast. I mean,
Yeah, in contrasting them, one of the lovely things about some North American aircraft is the tailwheel steering they have. Most of the Navy planes, with the tail wheel, it was either locked or unlocked, and if it was unlocked, it would just swivel. So then as you taxi down the runway or
Right.
taxiway, you have to use brakes.
Yeah.
So it's quite a bit of usage of the brakes. The Corsair is the same way.
really,
The Mustang has tailwheel steering, which is very nice. It also has a very wide tracked gear. On the Mustang, the Wildcat is very narrow. They designed that aircraft to land on a carrier deck that was always pointing into the wind. So the crosswind capabilities of the Wildcat are less than the Mustang. The Mustang
Really?
can tolerate much higher crosswinds than the Wildcat can, and not risk having running off the runway. We'll say that, to put it mildly.
with the radial and the inline, you have any? I mean, obviously you have big horsepower difference, but torque with the prop. Any gyroscopic effect because of the difference in the airplanes, or are they fairly similar?
I notice more trim requirements in the Mustang. The Mustang is very sensitive to being trimmed appropriately. at
Very
all
trim
times.
airplane.
Yeah, it's a
Very
very
trim
trim. Yeah,
Talk about
small
quick.
changes.
Talk about trim, so people understand what we're talking about.
Sure. Trim is a way to neutralize the control forces. So if I'm flying in cruise and I don't want to have to constantly be holding the stick one way or pushing on a rudder, I have little tabs on the back of the control surfaces. I can adjust a dial, and it will adjust an aerodynamic wing on the back of that control surface to hold the control surface there without me having to hold the control through cables in that
Right.
position. So it takes a lot of the workload off of the pilot when he's flying long distances, especially. But with the Mustang, almost any power change or configuration change requires a change to the trim.
You got to trim it out, Todd. You're nodding your head.
I'm
Jump
sure he
in.
can agree with me there. Yeah,
Yeah, I think it was John Mazzala. Do you know John Mazzala?
I do.
I think it was John that said you take the stick out of a Mustang and throw it away because you're flying the trim all the time.
Really?
1 inch of manifold pressure, anything. The coolant door going up and down, you're changing the rudder trim, elevator trim constantly.
Yeah.
Really.
That's why in cruise I would turn the doors off so I could just do it manually and the airplane would settle down very nicely and just cruise very nicely. But yeah, it's a very trim airplane, whereas others.
Yeah.
That
Others aren't.
leads us into probably our wrap up here, and we don't really have a hard out here. In other words, we're not going to commercial break, so we'll wrap this up. But the thing we're talking about, initially, and with Bob Pond and Bob's collection, Bob Pond, which is, God bless him and the Pond family, who started this museum. Bob was a Navy transport pilot, and he would fly anything. I mean, and he was very good friends with Steve Hinton. And if you haven't seen Steve fly, you need to. I always love watching him fly. I'll give Steve Hinton a plug. I just like watching him fly because he's very precise, and it's a joy to watch him fly. But Bob and Steve were really good friends, and I think, with... But you bring up a good point about cross-training on type. We have modified or migrated to where we have guys that are now Mustang drivers or P-63 drivers or very specific pilots as opposed to a jack-of-all-trades pilots, which used to be the norm. I mean, you had one guy who was a chief pilot, he flew everything. Is that a good thing? What do you think? I mean, don't throw anybody under the bus, but my point is... what we just talked about, if you've got a Wildcat in the stable and you've got a P-51 in the stable and they require different skills, and skills are muscle memory, for lack of a better right? You learn it, and you have to retain it. And if you don't do it a lot, you lose some of that. Talk about that a little bit. Do you think that is where we're headed, where we have very targeted people flying the airplanes? Again, part of it's liability too. The carrier likes to see high hours. So,
I don't have a great answer for that one. I think once somebody has mastered the T6 trainer as best they can, in the old military days, all the fighters were pretty much available to them, and most of the fighters were simpler in some respects to fly than the trainer. They wanted you to make your mistakes in the training environment rather than to bust up a big fighter. So maintaining proficiency in all those isn't quite as difficult as you might think, but the opportunity to do so is very limited. So
anymore. I mean, in our environment, it's difficult to say, take that P-51 out and ring it out 5 times a week.
Yeah.
Because of fuel and costs and everything else. The costs have gotten to the point where they're just ridiculous. So maybe it's just a function of the way the business has evolved.
Mm-hmm. There used to be an aircraft rating where you were allowed to fly all makes and models of experimental aircraft, and that kind of went away. There are still some people who have that, and they're allowed to fly virtually anything, but these days, if you want to fly an experimental aircraft, you have to receive training and basically almost like a type rating for that aircraft, which makes it a little bit more difficult to jump back and forth between a bunch of them. So.
I will tell you that when I fly with people, I do pay attention to that. Yeah. How often has that person been in that airplane? Because there are some of these airplanes, and I'm not talking about a coffin corner like with jets. Coffin corner is an aerodynamic term. Mm-hmm. But I pay attention to who I'm flying with for that reason. If they've been in the airplane recently, how much have they flown? Because some of these things, you can get yourself into a situation where the airplane will bite you straight up in the hiney. And, you don't want to have that happen. And I don't want to be in it when it does happen. Mm-hmm. So that's a bad thing, right? Do you agree, Todd? Or
yeah.
I think...
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But I also, if I can make a comment about the multiple airplanes, it is a difficult question, like Mike was saying, but I've had some limited experience with that. Most notably when we had the Bearcat. We had the Mustang and the Bearcat. And when we would go someplace, my dad and I'd go someplace, every stop we'd trade airplanes. So we were going back and forth every
That is
leg.
So cool. What a great experience.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's definitely a great experience. And I didn't have any problem transitioning to either one, even though the Bearcat was brand new to me. I went from that and then into this and the next leg and then back into that again and into this. And it wasn't an issue. And I think maybe the more of it you do, like with Steve, Steve flies a lot of stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean everything.
I think probably the more of it you do, the easier it is to do it. If you don't do it very often, it's probably more difficult. You probably should be a little more careful about jumping into another airplane. If you haven't flown that airplane in a long time, you've been flying this one for a long time, but haven't flown that one in 5 years. Maybe I shouldn't just jump in and fly away. But if you're flying them frequently, I think it is easier too. I think it just comes more naturally.
Now, Mike, we'll wrap up. I think you're going to the Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. What you flying over there?
The Wildcat.
Ha ha!
So the Wildcat's over there now. She went over on the USS Essex.
Yeah.
And one of my partners on the airplane is over there right now, and should be very. I guess epic would be the right word. I feel very honored to be able to do it, and it's just a thrill to be part of it. So.
I had, this was many lives ago, we used to know the guy who ran the National Park Service over there. And at that time, they were placing the monitoring devices around the Arizona because they monitor the degradation of the hull. And I can't do it anymore because I'm an old guy now, but I used to be a diver. And he said, oh, you want to go with them for one of those? And I thought, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be anywhere near that, and see somebody looking at me out of one of the portals or something. But what an amazing experience. Mm-hmm. You excited?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's got to be off the hook.
Yeah, no, it's going to be great.
I think, Todd, you and I, we're expecting swag, right?
Of course.
hats, T-shirts, underwear, whatever you're going to get. Steal something from the ship. But guys, I really appreciate you coming out. This hangar's not exactly balmy right now. It's a little warm. I want to thank you at home for joining us today. We're going to tape this, so maybe you might pick it up on tape. If you have questions, I'll have Greg throw up the email. You can send in questions. We'll answer in the comments section down there. Remember, go out and check us Warbird Wednesday every Saturday. We're not doing the kind of crazy hats and the other stuff, and this is a little more serious business. But check us out Warbird Wednesday every Wednesday when we have a new segment. We got another one coming up. And you have a wonderful day. Thank you.